Over the past 3 sessions, we've been looking at 2 very significant divisions in the early church which last to this day. And these divisions have often led to very messy overlaps in authority over certain areas of the world and to great confusion. Nowhere is this more the case than in India. Today, I want to step back from the nitty-gritty details and paint a broad picture of these divisions before zooming in on India to see how it all worked out there. So let's start by zooming out and summing up much of the course so far, and especially the past 3 sessions. Following the book of Acts, men like Ignatius and the authors of Barnabas and Clement were leading the church. It was a time of being increasingly separated from rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And the church faced great persecution. And although there were schisms and divisions and breaks here and there, leading to things like multiple popes in Rome for a time, none of these schisms were large enough or of long-term significance. The church in this period of history is often referred to as the Great Church. The Great Church. And this era has as its pinnacle the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which was made possible due to the conversion of Emperor Constantine and his single-handedly having control over the entire Roman Empire. Things changed due to the teaching of Nestorius, who wanted to keep the human and divine natures of Jesus Christ very separate. He was condemned as a heretic at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and this led to the Church of the East breaking away from the rest of the church. The Church of the East breaking away from the rest of the church. Today, the Church of the East remains as a shadow of its once incredible continent-wide glory and is primarily known as the Assyrian Church of the East. The Assyrian Church of the East. One of the key figures in condemning Nestorius as a heretic was Cyril of Alexandria from Egypt, who liked to strongly emphasize just how united the divine and the human natures of Christ were, united as one. At the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, the majority of the church turned against the traditional teaching of Cyril and argued for what is now known as Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. That is, that Jesus Christ is one person with 2 distinct yet united natures. Following this council, the church would fragment again, with the Egyptians and Ethiopians, as well as the Armenians and some in Syria, breaking away to form what is now known as the Oriental Orthodox Church. You now have 3 main branches of Christianity. The Chalcedonian branch in Europe and the remaining areas of the Roman Empire. The Church of the East, stretching from modern Syria and Iraq all the way across ultimately to the east coast of China. And the Oriental Orthodox Church, based in Egypt, African lands to the south and southeast of Egypt, as well as Armenia and parts of modern-day Syria. In places like Antioch, all 3 of these branches were in play at once. Now, given recent agreements between the Church of the East and some of the Chalcedonian churches, such as the Church in Rome, as well as some Oriental Orthodox churches and some Chalcedonian churches, such as the Church in Rome, it's now believed, generally speaking, that all of these churches are true Christian churches, with their differences being over language and phraseology rather than real meaning, though this is still debatable. An example of where this is not the case, if you think back, is to the Arians who followed the teaching of Arius that Jesus Christ was a created being and not eternally the Creator God. Arians are often forgotten about following their condemnation by the Great Church at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. But they actually remained a powerful faction in Western Europe and North Africa in particular till the mid-7th century. So let's visualise in a chart and for reference bring in a bit of future history as well as Arian Christianity, even though it is not truly Christian. Here's a chart I prepared earlier. We see here the Great Church. Arius breaks away. Not Christian. Arius is not Christian and eventually comes to an end in the late 7th century. The first major break in the United Church is, of course, at the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, when the Church of the East, following Nestorius, breaks away. And we now have today the Assyrian Church of the East and the Ancient Church of the East being the two main churches from here. In 1552, there was also a group of them who broke away from the Church of the East and joined the Roman Catholic Church. They're known as the Chaldean Catholic Church. So that's the first major break in church history. The second one comes with the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and the creation of what we call the Oriental Orthodox Churches. They are the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, also known as the Jacobites, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Ethiopian and the Eritrean Tewahedo Orthodox Churches, and the Malankara Orthodox Syriac Church, which is in India. There was also a group of them who broke off in 1745 to join the Armenian Catholic Church united to Rome, but these 6 churches remain independent to this day. Following the Council of Chalcedon, you have Chalcedonian Christianity, which eventually, in around the year 1000, would split off into the Eastern Orthodox churches, such as the churches of Greece and Russia today, and into what we call Roman Catholicism, which itself would have breakaways in the 1500s in the form of the Protestant Reformation. When we talk about church history, we normally think about Chalcedonian Christianity leading into Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, all of which are active in Europe. But we often forget, and that's why we've been doing these sessions, about the Church of the East and the Oriental Orthodox Churches. To help visualise that a little more, here's a map just to help us of Europe around 495 AD. Just for a bit of perspective really, all this area in red and orange is actually controlled by kingdoms belonging to Arian Christian kings. Not everyone in these areas was Arian, following the heretic Arius by any means. Of course, you've got the Pope in Rome who clearly is not an Arian. But Arian control was very strong in these areas, especially in North Africa. Of course, you have the rest of the Roman Empire where Arianism had no place at all. Arianism would slowly die out around this region and finally come to an end with the death of one of the kings of the Lombards. Let's have a look at another map just to help us visualise the actual Christian churches and the areas that they were active. Here's a map of what we call the Old World. You can see in Europe the modern day outlines roughly of Roman Catholicism in the dark and Eastern Orthodoxy in the light colour. That's the kind of area where these churches, the Chalcedonian churches who followed the teaching of Council of Chalcedon, were. In the red, you can see here, heading down to Ethiopia, Egypt, into Syria, and of course Armenia, you have the Oriental Orthodox churches. And in the yellow, especially also down here in India, along the coast here, you have the Church of the East. All of this central area here would ultimately be wiped out from Christian presence by various regimes in China, the Mongol invasions, and especially the genocides of Tamerlane in the 14th century. It's here, on the coast of the Mediterranean, in Syria, where you would have the city of Antioch, where you've got all three of these churches, the Oriental, the Church of the East, and Chalcedonian churches, all being active kind of around here. It's amazing to think of the spread of Christianity in these early centuries of the church. So, those are the charts and maps to help us visualize what we've been talking about in the last three sessions rather. So what about India, the country where nearly all of these branches of Christianity are found to this very day? The historic Christian churches in India are known as St. Thomas Christian churches, and there are 8 different St. Thomas Christian churches which are affiliated either to Roman Catholicism, to Protestantism, to the Church of the East, or to Oriental Orthodoxy. How did we get here, and what is unique about the Indian churches? How has existing alongside a Hindu majority nation for nearly 2,000 years impacted the Christianity of that land? According to tradition, St. Thomas, the apostle who doubted that Jesus had truly been raised from the dead, was the first to bring Christianity to India along the Malabar coast, that's the southwestern coast of India, and he brought it there in particular. Roughly, that is the modern state of Kerala, which remains about 18% Christian to this day. And this tradition that it was St. Thomas who brought Christianity to India is first recorded in the 2nd century, and it claims that King Gundafar invited Thomas to come and evangelize. Now, research has proven that there was a King Gundafar about that time in that area when Thomas is supposed to have travelled. And there were strong, very busy trade routes between the Roman Empire and Persia and the Malabar coast, which were active at that time. An alternative theory is that the churches in India are from what is known as the church planting of a certain Thomas of Cana. Thomas of Cana was a Persian merchant who fled persecution and settled in Kerala in 345 AD. He was fleeing the persecution likely brought on by the Council of Ephesus. He would have been a Nestorian Church of the East Christian. Part of the Church of the East, he came under their authority. Further persecution from the rise of Islam drove even more Christians to settle on the coast in Kerala. And the isolation of these Christians behind the strong Indian kingdoms of the north saved them from the genocides of Tamerlane in the late 14th century, which almost annihilated Christianity across Central Asia and the Middle East. Presuming that it was St. Thomas, the apostle, who first evangelized part of India, it seems likely that the arrival of Thomas of Cana certainly settled things and brought these churches into allegiance to the Church of the East and the teaching of Nestorius, rather than what would become Chalcedonian Christianity, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy in the old Roman Empire. Now, being mainly from the wealthier merchant families, Christians in Kerala fitted into the caste system of Hinduism as one of the higher level castes in society. They were confined to their own ethnic group, and although eventually they adopted the local language, their liturgy and church worship remained in the traditional Syriac of the Church of the East. The fact that they were regarded as a higher caste is significant and would cause problems and tensions later on, indeed still to this day. And so the church in India remains part of the Church of the East for over a millennia. But things change with the arrival of the Portuguese and the Jesuit missionaries and the Inquisition in 1498. The Portuguese began subjecting the local Christian population and demanding after 1552 that they convert to Roman Catholic aligned churches. They prevented messengers from the Church of the East, the Nestorian Church, coming into the area, and thus severed India's communion with its historic church family. When the highest ranking local minister of the local church died in 1599, the Portuguese convened the Synod of Diampa and had all the local Christians subjugated to Roman Catholic aligned archbishops. The Synod of Diampa outlawed the acceptance of the Hindu caste system, which the local churches had adopted. It had local Bibles burnt, and it outlawed the traditional Syriac liturgy. At this time, the presence of the church in India largely ended, unless they were aligned to Roman Catholicism. But a few holdout congregations kept the old ways of the Church of the East. Unsurprisingly, anti-Portuguese sentiment due to heavy-handed persecution grew, and when a charismatic Christian figure called Ana Fahala appeared to have been captured and murdered by the Portuguese, they had had enough. Gathering around a large outside crucifix called the Cunan Cross, they rebelled against the Jesuits and the Portuguese and broke off. 12 ministers laid hand on an archdeacon and appointed him their bishop, thus starting the Malankara Church, which was not recognised by those who stayed loyal to Rome, who were now known as the Syro-Malabar Church. So now we have 3 churches in India in around the 1500s. We have 2 main groups, the Syro-Malabar Church aligned to Rome and the Malankara Church, and the small group still loyal to the Church of the East. But who would the Malankara Church look to support? The Church of the East had been all but destroyed by Tamerlane and others, and contact seemed very unlikely. In 1665, support came instead from the Oriental Orthodox Church, the Copts in Ethiopia, and especially the Jacobite Syrian Church. It was the Jacobite Syrian Church who sent a new bishop to India, although there are serious questions over whether the people in India thought that this Syrian bishop was actually from the Church of the East they used to be aligned to, and not the Oriental Orthodox Church. Either way, the church became split in 3. Those who supported Rome, those who supported the newly arrived Oriental Orthodox bishop, and the small holdout who stayed loyal to the historic Church of the East. But the complexity doesn't end there. Oh no! Let's look at that first part of the church which stuck with Rome and those loyal to the Church of India in the old ways. Around 1708, Bishop Mar Gabriel arrived in India, sent by the Patriarch of the Church of the East. And though he faced great opposition from the Oriental Orthodox churches and from the Roman Catholic factions, he strengthened the traditionalist community and sporadic contact was re-established. In 1862, the Church of the East Patriarch consecrated an Indian to be metropolitan, that is, the top bishop in India. A further bishop was sent in 1874, who successfully persuaded many Roman Catholic aligned Christians to join the Church of the East, claiming that the Pope had given authority in India to that church. Of course, the Pope had not granted this authority, and when this was discovered, many returned to the pro-Rome churches, but many stayed. Further bishops were sent over the next 50 or so years, and between them they revitalised the Church of the East in India, which is now known as the Chaldean Syrian Church. The Church of the East in India is the Chaldean Syrian Church. And what of the Oriental Orthodox Churches, the Malankara Orthodox Syriac Church? Well, here is where the real fun begins. In 1772, a group split off from them and called themselves the Malabar Independent Syrian Church. They held the same theology as the Oriental Orthodox Churches of Syria and Egypt, etc., but they're not recognised as being part of that communion with the Copts and the Ethiopians and the Armenians. A century later, 1889, more splits would come. The issues came this time when Britain had arrived with its Reformed Protestant Anglicanism a century before. At first, relations between the local churches and the Church Mission Society were positive. CMS missionaries taught in Oriental Orthodox seminaries. But soon the locals agitated for reformation, to be more like the Anglicans with the Bible as their absolute authority in all things. And this was brought about because Anglican missionaries, of course, insisted that the Bible had to be translated into the local language. And once that was happening, things began to change, just as they did in Europe 300 years before. Key to this was a priest called Abraham Malpan from the, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Palakunafu family, known as the Martin Luther of the East. Abraham Malpan emphasised Bible reading and study, family worship and evangelism, as well as high moral standards, and he strove to restore the church to its former pristine purity and ancient ways. He opposed prayer for the dead, intercession of the saints, veneration of the sacrament, the so-called sacrament of the confessional. He insisted that people receive both the bread and the wine at the Lord's Supper. And as was common to Anglicans at the time, especially evangelicals, he insisted on the removal of images and statues from places of worship. In 1836, Abraham Malpan declared that these reforms were necessary, and he was suspended from ministry by his bishops. But he nonetheless went on and conducted a communion service in the local language at his home parish. And those who supported him went to their own parishes and did the same, celebrating the Lord's Supper in the local language understood of the people. This led to Abraham Malpan being excommunicated. But before he died in 1842, his son managed to get consecrated by the bishop in Antioch because the patriarch there didn't know that he was a Reformed Christian. He went back to India, being a bishop, and started consecrating his own ministers. In 1889, a legal case over who had authority in India led to the Reformed Christians breaking away and forming the Mar Thoma Syrian Church. Okay, now we have Christians aligned to Rome, to the Church of the East, to the Oriental Orthodox Church, a church that is completely independent of the Oriental Orthodox Church, but believes what they believe, and also Protestants, all claiming to be St. Thomas Christians. In 1930, some of the Oriental Orthodox Christians would break off and align themselves with Rome by forming the Syro-Malankara Catholic Church. The Oriental Church would divide further in 1975 to become the Jacobite Syrian Christian Church and the traditional Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, whilst the Protestant Reformed Mar Thoma Syrian Church would have its own breakaway group leave in 1961 called the St. Thomas Evangelical Christian Church, which leaves us with 8 St. Thomas churches and a bit of a headache. Let's try and visualise this with another helpful chart. What do we have here? We have St. Thomas arriving in India around 52 AD. We have in the 4th century them joining the Church of the East, the followers of Nestorius, probably with Thomas of Cana. and remaining loyal to the Church of the East until this time here in the 1500s, where we have the Synod of Diamper, at which point everyone was subjugated to Roman Catholicism. Then we have the Coonan Cross oath and statement, at which point many break away into following Roman Catholicism, many rejoin the Church of the East, or they join into the Oriental Orthodox Churches. From those who stayed loyal to Rome, we have another break coming in 1814, and in 1814 they align themselves to the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East, although in India they are called the Chaldean Church in Syria. And then of course you have the Syro-Malabar Church, which is the long-standing Roman Catholic presence in India. With the Oriental Orthodox, we have a breakaway faction becoming independent in 1775, and here we have the, of course, Protestant split. The Protestant churches break away with the Mar Thoma Syrian Church, and then the Syrian Thomas Evangelical Church. And the Oriental Orthodox churches divide. Some divide again and rejoin with Roman Catholicism. They unite in the main brand and divide again. And so we have the Jacobite Syrian Christian Church and the Malankara Orthodox Christian Church. 8 churches. Church of the East, 2 aligned with Roman Catholicism, 2 aligned with Oriental Orthodoxy, 2 aligned to Protestantism, and 1 independent Orthodox Church. Very, very confusing. Do feel free to pause the video and take in all of that information if you would like. So, we're almost done. But just to mention, there is also the Anglican Communion Churches of North and South India. Although the breakaway faction, the Mar Thoma Christian Church, were very influenced by Anglican missionaries, they're not, strictly speaking, Anglican churches. The Anglican Communion Churches of North India and South India are part of the Anglican Communion, but they're actually what's known as united churches. They're created by the joining together of lots of different Anglican, Presbyterian, Methodist and independent Protestant churches all into one church, but aligning themselves with Anglicanism, attending the Lambeth conferences, although they also, for example, attend the World Council of Methodist Churches. Pentecostalism is also growing rapidly in India today, and one major issue is that the traditional St. Thomas Christian churches often still hold, if not in word, at least in practice, to the old caste system of Hinduism, which separated society into higher and lower castes, and at the very bottom were the untouchables, or the Dalits, who make up the very poor in society. Now, these Dalit Christians make up the majority of the missionary Protestant churches. Being poor and undesirable by society, they were ripe for revival to break out. Funny that, given the teaching of Jesus about those who are outcast and those who are poor and those who are not loved by the rest of society. But the traditional churches are still mainly made up of those from this upper separate Christian caste. And sadly, people from the Dalit caste, the untouchable caste, who join these churches are still denied access at times to things like the same bread and the same cup at communion. It's a form of persecution made all the worse because these Dalit caste Christians not only lack access to some Christian churches, but also lack access to government aid and help against such discrimination because of their caste. So that is the church in India in all its complexity, as well as an overview of the state of the historic churches of the world. If your brain isn't hurting, then you probably haven't been concentrating. Do go back and pause the video at the different charts that helpfully lay out how these churches have broken away and what they're called today. They're the key takeaway, really. Next session, we're returning to something a bit more simple, and we're looking at the origins of monasticism. So hopefully you will join me then.